Well, today we're going to talk about the all important imposter syndrome. Anybody that's taken on a new role or moved into a kind of a transitional opportunity may suffer an episode of feeling just like that. My guest today is going to help us understand that, unpack that, and hopefully give you a quick fix for it. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense with your host, Doug Thorpe. Here's Doug.
Greetings, everyone. You are listening to another episode of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. I am your host, Doug Thorpe. And as the intro said, today we're going to dive into the idea of dealing with the imposter syndrome. I frequently run into that question when I engage new clients. I get people that have recently been promoted or moved into a role, or maybe even they've decided to go start a company and quickly realize they're playing that role of you look in the mirror and say, man, if anybody knew what I really knew or didn't know, they're really going to come after me. So my guest is a gentleman named Scott Anderson. He's got some experience in that realm, and he's going to share that with us today. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Doug. Great to be here.
And while we were in the green room getting cranked up here, we were talking, Scott's calling in from Omaha, Nebraska, and we share a bit of a love for the game of college baseball. And of course,
yes, we do.
If you know it, the College World Series was just there in Omaha. So, Scott, you were doing some workshops, I think, around that, weren't you, with some leaders?
I think I was, yeah. As a matter of fact, I think I was doing some workshops at that time, mainly on burnout, executive burnout, entrepreneur burnout, that kind of thing. Yeah, I was.
Yeah, I'm sure good work. And that's also a hot topic. And depending on how our time runs out here, we may actually dip into that a little bit.
Sure.
Because, man, in this thing they call the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, burnout's a big deal
it is.
among executives. But before we dive into all of that, Scott, give us a little stroll down memory lane. Tell us a little bit about your journey to get to where you are now.
Sure. Well, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've launched 9 businesses and sold 6. 2 of the 3 I haven't sold are nonprofits that are still operating and doing well. One of them is called ateaseusa.org, which is a post-traumatic stress disorder research accelerator, helping military families recover from post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm also a licensed mental health therapist. We've learned a lot about PTSD and found that there's actually a lot of commonalities between post-traumatic stress disorder and burnout. Interestingly, there's sort of a traumatic origin in both of them. But anyway, I'm an executive coach, licensed mental health therapist, and work with entrepreneurs and C-suite leaders in companies across the country, a couple in Europe, and come from a long line of entrepreneurs, goes back generation after generation. And so to me, being an entrepreneur was the normal, natural choice. Whereas I talk to first-time entrepreneurs who, for them, it's just a crazy decision, or their families think it's a crazy decision. But in my, in my world, that was the only decision in a way.
That's interesting. We share a little bit of that DNA, perhaps.
Yeah.
I actually, I think I shared with you, I was the only son of a single mom who became an entrepreneur before I got out of high school. And of course, that was a scary time, but she made it go and worked hard at it, and actually kindled a fire in me.
Yeah.
And even though I left college, went in the military, and then into banking, I never lost my passion and desire to be an entrepreneur. And when the time came and I was able to do it, I jumped in and made that pivot myself, and have been doing it ever since.
Hats off to your mom. That is really amazing.
It was gutsy, and
wow.
we're talking, yeah, we're talking the 1960s when corporate America was really kind of old school, and a woman at work was a secondhand citizen, second-class citizen.
Right.
And
Right.
my mom had enough gumption that she didn't want to put up with that. She wanted to plow her own road, and she did.
Wow.
And she built an interior design business that
Really?
became quite a force in the region, and a lot of
Wow.
well-respected businesses were calling on her. She had a great run with it. So that was my summer job most of the time. As I went
Oh,
through high
yeah.
school and into college, I was doing stuff on her jobs, helping
Wow.
install things and move furniture and paint walls and all the
I've
fun
got
stuff.
so much admiration for single parents, but single moms in particular. We have a couple of single moms in our mastermind group. We have a weekly mastermind group for folks in our burnout program, and there's a woman in our program who is single mom with 3 little kids, on, as she said, on welfare and everything else, and just broke. And she, just by pure grit and willpower, has built herself up. She's now running she's a executive with a large wind energy company, and she's running the most successful region of this international company. But when I hear stories like that, I mean, I've got 4 kids, and I had a hard time doing it with a great wife. There's no way in the world I could be a single mom and run a business, and I don't know how they do it. I really don't.
Yeah, no, I agree. And like I said, I knew something special was going on in my house. I just didn't understand exactly what it
Wow.
was.
I
But
guess.
I, of course, quickly learned later exactly the significance of what we had going on.
Yeah.
But anyway, hats off to that. So let's shift into this idea of imposter syndrome. So,
Sure.
from your experience, first, let's start with how do you define it, or how do you diagnose it for somebody?
Sure. Well, actually, the first people to identify imposter syndrome were 2 psychologists named Clance and Imes, and they're kind of they created the imposter syndrome um, verbiage, the designation. They created the term imposter syndrome, and the way that and pretty much the way that they defined it then, and the way that I define it myself with my clients, and I also want to say that 70% of people will have some kind of an experience with imposter syndrome. And yet one of the common traits about imposter syndrome is I'm the only one in the world who feels this way. Everybody else is who they say they are, but I'm the only imposter. And one of the things I always tell my clients is, well, you may be the only one, but you're in the vast majority. 70% of business people at a minimum. I was leading a workshop in Indianapolis not long ago, and I was conducting on an imposter syndrome, and I asked this room of 150 entrepreneurs who had all completed an imposter syndrome assessment. In fact, I'll give you a link to it. But they all raised their hands. I said, okay, who scored above X in the imposter syndrome assessment? Every hand went up. And they were really surprised because they thought they were the only ones. But to your question, the definition of imposter syndrome, as I see it, is the feeling that your success comes mainly from luck or timing or connections or selling people, maybe even conning people, but it doesn't come from personal skill and talent. And it's only a moment of time before someone's going to pull down the curtain and reveal that you're a fraud. And it's an anxiety disorder. And it's not unlike lots of other anxiety disorders, people who are afraid of flying, people who are afraid of, I've worked with clients that have a phobia about death. But it's like any other anxiety disorder where you have an erroneous fear about something. But it happens so often in business, I think, especially the more of a high achiever you are or overachiever you are, especially if you're a perfectionist kind of a personality type, the more likely you are to have imposter syndrome at least some point in your career. But that's the main thing, is you just feel like I got here completely on luck or connections. It has nothing to do with who I am. And pretty soon everybody's going to find out. And it's the pretty soon everybody's going to find out part that really torments people, because it's the fear of the shoe dropping and you being found out.
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
That's it, exactly.
Famous line from The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
It does manifest itself more often than most people appreciate. And I'm like you. I don't have the statistical data to speak to it, but I can just attest that in my own coaching practice, I've had the privilege of working with literally at this point thousands of leaders and owners, and a huge majority, and if just mentally as I do the math in my mind, 70% sounds about right, that people suffer
Yeah.
that, and at least in some degree or another. And I'm thinking of one gentleman recently that maybe it was about a year ago. He had gotten promoted up. He had been hired to be the heir apparent to a department head in a large national bank, and had a beautiful resume, wonderful track record in his line of business, and had specifically been recruited to be the heir apparent. 2 years went by, and sure enough, the senior guy decided to retire and leave and sail off in the sunset, and the movement was made, and this person became the head and immediately began suffering the imposter syndrome.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that's when I was called in, and as we went through the work and did everything, I was trying to, I at least took the approach of trying to give him some tangible handholds and footholds to grab onto, kind of like scaling the mountain, right? You want those firm footings to grab into. We started going through the body of work and the experience and the development, and all of a sudden one day he said, I've been thinking about this. He said, I'm an idiot. He said, there's no reason I should be thinking this whatsoever.
Yeah.
He said, I've even added to the list you helped me create. And he said, the only thing I need to do is start thinking about future direction. I don't have to look back. I don't have to worry about anything. He said, I just need to get busy in establishing the way forward, and I'm good to go.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So much of it has to do with getting out of your head and into your life and getting busy. And part of what imposter syndrome is this, it's, like a sort of a spiraling, a vicious cycle. The psychologists would call it rumination, where you just keep going over and over and over something that doesn't profit you to keep going over and over and over. Because the question is a question that really isn't answerable, because it's a false premise. The question is, how do I avoid being found out? And really, I mean, that's at the root of the imposter syndrome, is what do I have to do to make sure nobody finds out that I don't know what I'm doing? But the false premise is that you don't know what you're doing. And so there's no answer to that question. But people can get stuck in that, and it can really cost you.
I think that rumination is, laymen probably think about it and talk about it just as the tape that plays in your head, that
exactly
continuous loop. Whether you're an old cassette guy or a VHS guy, there's a tape going on in there. And I've often said, being somewhat, reflecting on my old days in real estate, I've said one of the most valuable and troubling pieces of real estate is the 6 inches between your ears.
Oh man, is it ever?
If you can learn how to manage that real estate, you can manage anything. And
that's right.
It is a huge challenge. So where do you begin the work, Scott, with trying to help people overcome that imposter syndrome?
Sure. Well, the first place to start, and it sounds like the place where you started with your client, Doug, is just to acquaint them about what imposter syndrome is. So a bit of just basic education, and it really helps to know that you're not only not alone, but you're in the vast majority if you've got imposter syndrome. It's very, it just couldn't be more common. And it seems like that the folks that are the most affected by it are those that often have very challenging jobs and are, really are stretching themselves every day. and are really reaching for the stars, if you will, or have very high level of responsibility. And often these folks have their minds are sort of designed to make sure that they're not overpromising and under-delivering. It's actually a quality. But you're exactly right. It's a tape that gets stuck in people's heads, and it's not unlike, lots of other tapes that get stuck in people's heads. And that's the way I try to begin with, is just to explain that this is it's very, very, very common, especially in high achievers, especially in people that set very high standards for themselves, potentially unreasonable or unrealistic standards for themselves. That it really is just the 6 inches between your ears. And so that's the first part, is some education. The second part is to do some reality testing, and to really ask folks, is this true? Because a lot of the private thoughts that we have, we don't share with anybody, and especially imposter syndrome. That's not, the feeling that you're a fake or a fraud is not something you share with everybody. In fact, you probably want to not share it with anyone. And as a result, there's no reality testing going on. You don't ask yourself, boy, I wonder if my thought about being an imposter is true. But that's the second phase that I try to do, is reality testing, of helping people, of just asking them to some reality-based questions. Is this really true? And also, a lot of times the problem with imposter or fraud or fake is such a blurry term that it's impossible to answer, because the term is so blurry. And so I asked them to put it in very specific words. When you say you're an imposter, what do you really mean? And when you get them to put it in more concrete, specific terms, then usually they'll come to the conclusion on their own that, well, I guess I'm not an imposter. For example, with your client, why did he get appointed to a high position? If we went down his record of what he did to perform to get there, I'm sure that it would become obvious over time that he more than deserved the opportunity. So that's the second phase, is I try to get folks to first to become educated on what it really is and how common it really is and why it exists. The second piece is reality testing. And then the third part is just to realize that this is a tape in your head, and it's really your mind repeating something, trying to keep you safe. It really is a reflection of people who have high integrity, people who don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. There's, the opposite but equal disorder, and I forget what it's called, are people who think that they are much smarter than they really are. I forget what that syndrome's called, but they're people who have.
I can think of a few words.
I could too. Kind of the smartest guy in the room syndrome. But folks who don't realize that they don't know everything, but they come across and truly believe, it's the opposite of the imposter syndrome. And that's really a lot more dangerous, right?
Oh, totally.
Are deluded.
Very much so. You touched on the idea that also maybe closely related and associated with imposter syndrome is the person that does have some perfectionistic tendencies. Their personality is wired for perfectionism, and
Yes.
I certainly run into that a good bit in the executive coaching realm. That
right.
And interesting for me, the one way it typically manifests is clients will come to me saying, I can't seem to make a decision. I want to talk to you about my decision-making ability. And as we dig into it, it becomes a discussion about procrastination, and procrastination in my book, and I'm not a trained psychologist, but just in life, street smart experience, the majority of people who procrastinate are doing so because they don't have the perfect answer.
Exactly.
They're wired for perfection, and because they can't achieve that, they're not going to act, and that's going to become the stumbling block.
Exactly. One of the leadership programs that I most admire is the United States Marine Corps, and they have a decision-making process that's unique to the Marines, and their decision-making process is based on 75% of the information. And the thinking behind it, it's all based on statistics, but the idea is if you have 75% of the available situation or available information for a given situation, then make a decision. Because the problem with getting 100% is A, you can't get 100%, and B, the time it takes to get 100% means that the data is it runs out of date. It's no longer accurate in the time period that it takes to get so much more information. So the Marine Corps teaches an early leadership program, get 75% of the information and make a decision and take action right away. And as a result of taking action, you'll get a lot more information about your next step and your next step and your next step. So it's kind of the anti-perfectionist idea, but their data says that the attempt to get 100%, which we can't have, but we want as perfectionists sometimes, makes it impossible to make a decision because you can't get to 100%. But by the time you get it, the data is old and no longer accurate.
I've had the chance over the last 5 years to be inside 3 large global brands, and I'm not going to name names, but there was a very common theme, and that was this 75 versus 100% thinking process. And the senior leadership of all 3 of these companies, and they're very diverse. They have nothing in common other than they're big and they're global.
Yeah.
They each had the same basic scenario. Senior management had determined that there had been a legacy and a tradition of hammering out the 100% certainty of it before making a decision, and they were feeling the pain of losing opportunity in the marketplace because, as you said, the time to get that extra 25 took too long. Market had moved, opportunity gone, etc. So they began a culture change to embrace the 75% thinking.
Yes.
And it was interesting. In 2 of the 3 cases, I was there long enough to see it work, and people were embracing it on a day-to-day. But the one thing the company failed to do was adjust their annual assessment process.
Exactly.
And so 364 days of embracing the comfort with 75% certainty versus 100%. And then on day 365, they evaluated for 100% performance.
Yeah.
And everybody that had achieved 75 was downgraded.
Oh my.
And it's like, are you kidding me, guys?
Yeah.
Do you even understand? Do you even understand what you just did?
Yeah, happens so often. There's I was just talking to a client a few minutes ago about, and you're probably familiar with this philosophy called appreciative inquiry. But the concept behind it is to focus on the things that you're doing right and that are working, instead of our kind of normal American management technique of managing by exception, managing by error, managing by failure. The appreciative inquiry idea is focus all of your attention on the things that you're doing that work, that are successful, and to try to do more of those things. And there was a great video. In fact, I'll send it if I can find it. Right after 9/11, the U.S. Navy commissioned this, I think it was a statistician from Case Western in Cleveland, to come out and talk to them about appreciative inquiry. And right after 9/11, all military branches were very down and disheartened, of course, because of their perceived failure with 9/11. The 9/11 commission was going on. And he encouraged them to start looking at when were the times where you really got this right, when you got things exactly right. And the problem with 9/11 was that all of their decision-making processes took too long, and the data was too old, and they couldn't act as quickly as they needed to. So they started to look at ways where they act quickly and get accurate information disseminated very quickly. And they started to focus on that. And when they did that, that was what happened. Their communication of essential information and their responsiveness increased dramatically. And at the same time, so did their morale, because the morale was terrible, as you can imagine, after 9/11. Yep. But it was such a counterintuitive approach, especially for American management and for the Navy in particular, because they had a very structured top-down kind of a process, but it was too slow, very much like that 100% model. It was just too slow to be helpful.
Yeah. Well, Scott, this has been great. We're going to take a quick pause and put in a commercial message, and we're going to be right back after this break.
Business is all about solving complex problems as fast as you can create them. Become the best problem solver by leading others to greatness too. And the first step is going to DougThorpe.com. Doug Thorpe is known globally for coaching entrepreneurs and business leaders, improving their performance and the work output of everyone surrounding them. You can find health, wealth, and happiness by learning to lead others to health, wealth, and happiness. Go to DougThorpe.com now and order Doug's books or hire him to coach your managers. That's DougThorpe.com.
Well, all right, we're back, and today I'm talking with Scott Anderson. We are talking about the imposter syndrome. And as we went to break and kind of went in the green room, Scott and I were continuing our chat, and we went into a discussion about the longer term effects if you can't fix your sense of the imposter syndrome and climb out of that loop. Say again, Scott, what you were telling me in the green room
Sure,
about some of
you
the
bet.
aspects.
Yeah, what we find is, again, and it's very much like the multinational companies that you mentioned that are trying to hit 100%. If you're already kind of a high performance, overachieving person and a perfectionist to boot, the problem with imposter syndrome is that you try to compensate somehow. You try to soothe your own fears, basically, that you're going to be found out as a fraud. And so, if you're not talking to an executive coach like Doug, you might not, and you're just having this conversation between the 6 inches between your ears, it's an echo chamber. And what perfectionists tend to do, and what a lot of high achieving people try to do, is the solution is usually, I'm going to work harder and worry more. And that way I won't be a fraud. Then I will be legitimate. I will be, I will prove to myself and others that my achievements are based on my skill and ability and not on luck. And the problem with that is that's one of the things that leads to overwork and ultimately to burnout, because it's a black hole. You can't, when you've got this tape running in your head and you're after 100% perfection, you're never going to get there. It is a black hole, no matter how hard you work, no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you worry, no matter how much you want it. And so unfortunately, at that point, folks can get into burnout. And the anxiety disorder can really get worse. And then their behavior really can, or their performance really can be compromised. I see sometimes folks who will try to compensate for the anxiety. And at this point, it becomes an anxiety disorder. They compensate by drinking or drugs or, other forms of basically avoiding the issue, trying to escape the issue, which can compound this downward spiral. So if you're fortunate enough to talk to a coach like you, Doug, then that's half the battle, just to try to air this thing out and to introduce some reality to it.
Well, and sadly, it does happen that people don't recognize that soon enough, and they work it in a private solitude that
Yes
is just a kind of their own form of living hell. And
it is.
Is there something a peer can look for and recognize in a colleague who might be going down the rabbit hole?
Sure. Well, the World Health Organization is now designated workplace burnout as a bona fide disorder, and the American Psychiatric Association, and I'm sure soon burnout will appear in the Diagnostic Service Manual, the DSM. The three primary symptoms identified by the World Health Organization are, first, an exhaustion that you can't really recover from. Or in other words, no matter how much, if you get a good night's sleep or even a week's vacation, there's still this pervasive feeling of bone weariness. And with that comes a real lack of motivation in people that were previously super passionate about what they were doing. That's the first thing to look for. The second thing is isolation. And this is one of the things that I've been noticing right now. A lot of the workplaces that I'm familiar with offer a hybrid situation where you can kind of come to work, or sometimes you need to come to work for specific meetings, but that you have the freedom to not work from home. And I'm all for remote working, and I've worked remotely for a long time. But for some people, it can be really kind of dangerous and can be kind of a convenient way to isolate. And so isolation is the second pillar of or symptom of burnout, that people become withdrawn and disconnected, and they feel withdrawn and disconnected. They don't feel connected anymore to their team or their company or their customers, their partners, their investors, and may begin to act like it. And then the third phase, and this is where you're really getting to serious burnout symptoms and also consequences, is a feeling of not just disconnection and isolation, but antagonism or animosity towards coworkers, teammates, customers, investors, partners, etc., and even kind of a resentment towards partners. And so any of these three are really clear signs. But the one that's sort of the canary in the coal mine is that that bone tired exhaustion that doesn't go away with a good night's sleep.
I've been burned out for 20 years. No, I'm kidding. I have those days, not to say I don't. I have those days when I feel that kind of bone weary tiredness, but I count my blessings every day of getting to do what I get to do with people and helping organizations. And it is energizing. And even when I'm dealing with executives that themselves are expressing concern about where they are and whatever kind of spiral they might be into. Do you think the season we've gone through with this whole pandemic lockdown, do you think that's accelerated the level of burnout, or is burnout about the same that it's always been?
According to the Gallup folks, pre-COVID, and they've been studying engagement, disengagement, and burnout for a long time. And what they say is that pre-COVID, the percentage of people who said that they feel always burned out was something like 20%, and the people who feel often burned out was like 40%. And this has been a pretty, this statistic has held true for a long, long time, at least 10 years. But post-COVID, those numbers have just exploded, unfortunately. And in I think it was September, Gallup study in September of 2020, those numbers doubled. And since then, the most recent Gallup numbers that came out in first quarter of 2022 said that 89% of the American workforce says that they feel burned out most of or all of the time. And 80% of the workforce says that they are more burned out now than they were a year ago. And this is supposedly when COVID is lifted. Of course, I don't know if it has, but and those numbers are so startling to me. Even if they're half right, burnout is more of a problem than COVID is, really, at least in terms of the people that it affects. And so it's a very prominent problem. My experience anecdotally working with lots and lots of executives on burnout is that they were probably burned out pre-COVID, but COVID was the straw that broke the camel's back, I guess. That just the whole constellation of things, COVID and politics and the stock market crash following COVID in 2020, the whole catastrophe seemed to be the straw that broke the camel's back for a lot of people that were probably already on the brink of burnout.
Well, I was serious at the early part of the show when I made the reference to the term VUCA that has resurfaced.
Yes.
VUCA is the acronym for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And boy, if that doesn't describe our business climate right now, I don't know what does. There's no easy way to forecast. Well, even a 1-year plan is almost ludicrous now with the dynamics of things that are going on. But there's one element that I'm going to share in terms of anecdotal experience. One of my observations of what COVID has done, the work at home, lockdown aspects of everything we did for, a good 18 months, if not longer, I think people lost their boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
I think pre-COVID, those that were commuting to work, and that was a standard that they were used to their whole life. You wake up in the morning, you do your morning routine, you get ready, you get in your vehicle or whatever mode of transportation you use, you
Yeah,
make the commute to work, and then at the end of the day, you reverse it, you commute
yeah,
home. That
exactly.
commute window, as long and arduous as it might be, was still a break point. And most
Oh,
people
yeah,
maintained a discipline of cutting it off. And, maybe you did work your whole train ride home, but
yeah,
once you got home, you were done and you did
that's right.
family things. But with the lockdown at home, I think people were challenged by needing to juggle personal things throughout the day.
Yeah,
You had to deal with the kid, you had to trade off with your spouse or who was watching the children or who was monitoring the schooling or whatever you had going on. So
yeah,
you rationalize, say, well, I lost 2 hours there, I'm going to go make that up after dinner.
yeah,
I'm going to go plug back in, and next thing you know, you're online for 3 more hours, not two. And it just kept cycling. So those
yeah,
boundaries just went away.
yeah,
Ironically, a lot of the data I've read says that corporate productivity has what? Gone up. It didn't
yeah.
go down. It didn't go down.
No,
It went up.
no, yeah,
But people were working a lot of extra hours that they
that's
didn't
right.
otherwise work. And it wasn't even the expectation that they did. They just did it.
That's right. Yeah, boy, I think that's a great insight, Doug. I really do. And whether we are aware of cutting off during the commute, conscious or unconsciously, people did cut off during the commute, even if they worked on the train. I did that for a lot of years, but there was some kind of a cutoff that we all just we didn't. It wasn't unspoken, but we all sort of acknowledged a boundary that now seems to be erased. I was reading today in the Wall Street Journal about how if we're in a recession, I read this today, if we're in a recession, it's a recession like no other recession. Because what's happening is that unemployment is going down and profit is going up, even as we go into this recession. And I really believe that the reason that the profit is up and productivity is way up has to do with these boundaries being broken. But I just wonder what the cost is. There's a social scientist who has done the most research into burnout, and she calls it sprint as marathon. And it used to be we'd sprint at work until whatever time, get on the train, come home, and it was over. But now it's the sprint never ends. It's 100 yards followed by another 100 yards followed by another 100 yards, and it goes 24/7, 365. And I just wonder at what point this becomes unsustainable, and the margins that I read about in the Wall Street Journal today, and the productivity gains. At what point does that begin to go the other direction? Simply because people can't keep it up. We'll see.
I was part of a live case study back in the day, and it wasn't intended to be a case study, but it turned out to be one. The bank I worked for in the early 90s had started reading some doctrine about process improvement, and we embarked on a program to do just that. And the design of the program was to take department managers, vice presidents, and above, and apportion them into work study teams. And the idea was if you worked in this part of the bank and managed a group and a team, you were going to get assigned to go over to another department that you probably didn't know anything about. And you were going to do a white paper kind of analysis of how that group operated. And you were going to redesign the flows, the process, the procedures, and everything to see. This was a zero-based budget kind of exercise to see
Right.
what really needed to be done to remove those other units. But guess what? You didn't get to leave your day job. You had to do your day job. And then you had to go figure out how to do
No.
this other work. And we had targets and deadlines, and it was like an 18-month program.
Oh,
And so everybody kind of strapped on, and
oh man.
we doubled down and did all this work. And we found huge profit saving findings. And in fact, I mean, net, it was a huge gain for the profitability of the bank. But to your point, I love your phrase, at what cost?
Yeah.
We totally burned out several vice presidents and senior vice presidents in the process.
Yeah.
Thinking about it now, just in the context of what you and I've talked about, I think the guys we burned out were the ones that were the perfectionists.
Yes,
They were
that's
working
right.
themselves
That's right.
crazy to
That's
create
right.
a good answer for that study text they were supposed to be doing, but then they were still worried about their day job.
Yeah.
I guess that says a lot about me, that I'm not particularly wired that way. I endured it and was happy with the outcome. But the question at the end was, and I remember this discussion going around, senior management was saying, well, look what we did. We can do this all the time. We'll just think of something else. And everybody's going, oh, no, please don't do that.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
So it was an interesting case study.
That's the problem. I mean, and again, in I particularly see this in publicly traded companies. I do a lot of work with private equity companies that are really judged quarter to quarter, and it's the bottom line. And the problem with short-term reporting, and why I admire publicly traded companies that have stopped giving quarterly guidance, is that it's very difficult to build anything that has longevity if you operate quarter to quarter. And I think of it as the bride who's getting very, very thin to get into a very nice wedding dress. But again, it's just not necessarily a sustainable model. And it's the long, to me anyway, it's the long-term view. The older I get, the more I think about things that last versus short-term sort of flash in the pan results. What can you sustain over the long haul? Because it is a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Well, and fast forward to recent years, and actually it's longer than that even, but there's a body of work that I'm digging into, and this gentleman will be another guest on my show coming up. His name's also Anderson, by the way, but I don't know if any relations. Steve Anderson. He's done a study that he calls the Bezos letters. What he discovered is that Jeff Bezos, when he started writing letters to shareholders, he revealed his vision, his plan from day one.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a long haul plan. And he, for many years in a row, he said, if you need returns right now, don't invest in me.
Exactly.
It's not going to happen. And I'll just say it right now. But if you believe in X, Y, and Z, I'm your guy, and we're going to do this. Yeah. And here's what we're going to create, and so on and so on. And these letters, he came up with a framework that is 14 elements on this list of principles and beliefs about the way the company is going to go. And it is. I'm about halfway through the book. I'm trying to cram the book before I have to do the interview. But,
what is the book called? I've got to check it out.
It's called The Bezos Letters.
Okay. I used to read those letters every year. And because I live in Omaha, everybody in Omaha can quote Warren Buffett. And Buffett has always been a very much, a buy and hold long-term investor, and was always a big fan of Bezos. And the annual letters that Bezos wrote were patterned to begin with after Warren Buffett's letters in the Berkshire Hathaway report. But I used to read all the Bezos letters. I think it's just fascinating. I've got to pick up that book. That's going to be a great interview.
Well, he connected the dots going back to, I believe it's 1997 when the first one was cut. And he said, sure enough, the pattern and the flow, it's a giant 18-year blueprint that's just laid out page by page. And there's no variation, there's no deviation in it. It's just spot on the whole way through.
Well, this is the thing, to build enduring wealth, whether it's Amazon or Berkshire Hathaway or what have you, and this is one of the reasons why, I don't know if Amazon gives quarterly guidance, it probably does, but why companies like Berkshire don't give quarterly guidance is because that's not their approach. They're not going to make silly decisions in the short term that may cost the business in the long term. They're just not going to do it. And to me, it has a lot of merit.
my only one caveat to that is going back to my bank story. I was with this bank. It was a regional bank before the days of interstate and branch banking. And I was there 20 years, but during that run, we put together 64 consecutive quarters of earnings growth.
Wow. Oh my gosh.
And that included the Jimmy Carter prime rate at 21%. That day, those days of inflation.
Wow.
It included
16 years?
a simultaneous oil bust and real estate bust. That was baked in there. And then some boom years for sure. But yeah, and my takeaway from that, and I've actually used it with a lot of my business clients, there was a discipline about why and how we could do that. Mm-hmm. And it had to do with the way we approach budget and planning and living by the budget we created. Yeah. You know, there was no random exception to the budgets. I mean, everything was very carefully programmed and administered.
It has to be.
You know, if you were a line manager, it drove you nuts sometimes because you were being slammed by a spike in work and you wanted to add some people. But if that wasn't in your budget, you weren't going to get to add those people.
Yeah.
You know, point, period, end of paragraph. It was not happening.
Yeah.
And again, there were some managers that didn't suffer that, couldn't deal with it.
Sure.
But those of us that did, we were richly rewarded for what we got out of that.
Oh my gosh, that's an amazing 64.
Yeah, 16 quarters. Years, 16 of my 20 years. And the only reason we really didn't keep that string going is we did become subject to a merger with one of the New York money center banks, and all the accounting kind of changed. And I'm not saying for the bad, it's just that being able to isolate us as an earning entity just went away.
Yeah. Sure.
We were just a subsidiary of the bigger bank, and that kind of put an end to the string at that point. But
amazing.
Yeah. So anyway, it can happen, but I do agree with you. I think the business trend today is, I think there are people that are coming around to the longer view and the longer game. I know Simon Sinek talks about it a lot in his speeches. Mm-hmm. Talks about playing the long game. And I've even used that with some of my entrepreneur clients. Mm-hmm. You know, what is your long game? What are you really playing for, and where are you really going? And it makes a big difference for people.
It does. It's so funny. I was on a call with an entrepreneur client of mine today who was thinking about succession planning and possibly a liquidity event in 5 years. And I asked him where he wanted to be in 5 years. And like a lot of entrepreneurs, what he wants to do is just keep working and working and working. And his nose is really in his business the way it is right now. But one of the ways to kill a conversation is ask an entrepreneur where they want to be 5 years from now. And, you know, it's funny how few entrepreneurs can answer that question.
Absolutely.
You know, it hasn't even crossed their mind.
I have the same experience, and I have begun making it almost mandatory to have that discussion early in the coaching to really get a fix on where they're going and what they're thinking about. Well, Scott, this has been great. We're going to need to wrap it up. And,
my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Tell everybody how they can get a hold of you if they're interested in reaching out.
The best way is to go to burnoutbreakthrough.com if you're interested in specifically in preventing burnout or recovery from burnout. And that's the best way to get a hold of me, Doug.
Okay. We'll have that in the show notes, everybody. And I do want to remind you, we are coming to you both via audio if you're streaming with us right now, or we're on video over at YouTube on the channel by the same name, Leadership Powered by Common Sense. I'm also on Patreon if you would like to get over there and subscribe and participate in some other goodies and ongoing bonuses I've got for my membership community. You can do that. I'll have that link in the show notes as well. But I appreciate everybody dropping in and seeing us. And Scott, one last time, thank you very much.
My pleasure, Doug. Thanks.
So we'll see you next time, folks. Thank you for listening in. This is Leadership Powered by Common Sense. We'll see you later.
You've been listening to Leadership Powered by Common Sense, hosted by Doug Thorpe. If you would like to know more about the coaching and advisory services he provides, visit dougthorpe.com.